Our primary speaker is Tony Keissling. Tony is a husband, a father, a professor of organic chemistry, and a pro-life speaker. He has appeared on EWTN's program Defending Life with Father Frank Pavone. He has also spoken at the United Nations Conference on the Status of Women, and in his spare time, he builds ukuleles. I'm pleased to say that Tony has been a friend and a fellow church member of mine for many years, although we now are forced to only visit through Facebook mostly, because he teaches out at Mansfield University. So I'll let Tony tell you more about himself and what he has brought for us tonight. Tony Keissling.
After that wonderful testimony by Wendy, I almost wonder, why am I here? I mean, I wonder what I can add to this great discussion that's happening here in Scranton. And I guess I have to give a word of apology to my old friends from Hope Church. Sorry, but topics like this don't usually come up in normal conversations. So I know some of you were taken a little by surprise by the topic and why I'm here to speak tonight. And I just say I'm sorry, but on with the show. I like to call this interrupted lives. There are a lot of lives that get interrupted, and they get interrupted in an awful lot of ways. And one thing that I find really ironic, Wendy mentioned that the CareNet started in 2010, and it was in 2010 that I did some of that speaking for the very first time. I had met a woman. It doesn't sound good to say it that way, but her name is Rebecca Keissling. She is no relation to me whatsoever. I was poking around on the internet. Every now and then I search my last name because I have scientific publications in chemistry, and I like to know if any of them are being cited for any reason. So once in a while, not so much anymore, but I used to search the last name. And every now and then a name would pop up, and one day this Rebecca Keissling popped up. And I looked at the tagline that comes up on Google, and it said conceived in rape. And then I checked out her website, and she was at least in my interpretation, she was a high-profile lawyer, pro-life speaker. What would she ever want to know about me? But it took a little while before I sent an email to her, and I was quite shocked when I, within a day, had a response. And she was speaking, at that time, she was speaking several weeks later in Bath, New York, which is only about an hour away from Mansfield. So I took some time to go and visit with her. And she's the one that encouraged me to start doing this. And in 2010 is when I first did that, and because we're on Facebook together, Ken and I sort of connected over this CareNet facility, and also the one that I ended up involved in, which is Endless Mountains Pregnancy Care Center, operating in Towanda, Canton, and soon Sayre. But so it's just really kind of funny how sometimes things really seem to just fall together. Really strange. Almost as though somebody else is orchestrating it, don't you think? All right. Well, since you guys are all here for a fundraising for a pregnancy care center, I'm sure, whoops, all right, let me see. It clicked. That means it worked. Hey, all right. I'm sure that some of you are, or most of you are probably quite aware of some of the statistics that I am about to share with you on the magnitude of both live births and also abortions. If today is an average day, there are about 11,000 babies born nationally. Of course, we got to go to about 3 in the morning our time to cover California. But it was about 11,000, and if you know the magnitude of abortion, then you also know that there were about 3,500 pregnancies that ended today because of abortion. And again, that's nationally, and there are about numbers. To bring that a little closer to home, in Pennsylvania, probably about 400 live births, and a little over 100 in Pennsylvania that ended with abortion. These statistics come from two different sources. It's either Planned Parenthood's own statistic keeping arm, the Guttmacher Institute, or Pennsylvania Department of Health in the case of the PA numbers. And to bring that a little bit closer, I'll share with you this map. I teach chemistry. I can't help but get away with it without a graph. So I got to show you a graph of some kind. This time it's a map. Find Lackawanna County, right? It's right about, am I pointing right? It's that one, is it not? Of those 100 that were done today in Pennsylvania, roughly 11%, maybe, were done in this county. Luzerne, and of course, realize the color coding. These nice blue colors, near zero. This is Tioga County, right here. That's where I live. There are practically none. That's because we don't have a Planned Parenthood or anything, but people who seek an abortion cross over the New York line to Elmira to obtain one. And red, of course, would be the Philadelphia County right down there, and red means about half, not quite half, of the abortions that happened in Pennsylvania happened in Philadelphia County. So just to put some of this into perspective as to where things are happening. And of course, a question comes up, why? I have a few reasons that I picked off of surveys. Now, these reasons are given by women who have had an abortion or are planning to get one, and the percentages don't add up because they can choose more than one reason. So just keep that in mind as you read these and realize that about 3/4 of them say having a baby would dramatically change their life. And I'm sure you are familiar with some of these statements, having heard them elsewhere. And about the same numbers would say, I can't afford a baby now. About half of them will say becoming a single mom, do not want to become a single mom, or they're having relationship problems. And in that relationship problems come a lot of things, understand that, and they're not specified. Maybe entering into divorce, maybe a boyfriend breakup, lots of different reasons, but they just can't see themselves becoming a single parent now. Third, perhaps, I believe they've completed childbearing. A third, not ready for a or another child. A quarter, don't want anyone to know they're pregnant or had sex. You might imagine that certain age groups would fit better in some of these statements than other age groups. Don't feel mature enough. Husband or partners pressuring to have an abortion. Then there are the health issues, not to minimize those things which may be very serious conditions or risks, but health of the fetus, concerns over the mother's health. Parents want her to have an abortion, 6%. And last but not least, I share with you this one, 1%, a victim of rape. And I've added in the parenthesis because I think this is really true. 1% of the abortions that happen carry with it 99% of the emotion. How many, and just think back on this last election cycle, and remember how many politicians went off of the radar screen because they were interviewed by a talking head who asked a question like, "You mean to tell me that you would force a woman to keep a child that she conceived through rape?" Or the politician who answered and had to sort of try to justify it by saying genuine rape. We have poor ways of talking about this particular issue. And so I think part of my purpose in being here tonight is to give you maybe a new way. It's not just a statistic. It's real life, real people. It's not just a number on a piece of paper. But my point still being that this does ratchet up the emotions of this particular small slice of those 3,500 abortions that happened today. And because of that, this one small section is used both as a justification and an exception. The justification for the pro-choice crowd. Well, you got to keep abortion because you have women getting raped and becoming pregnant. But then also in the pro-life community. Well, I'm pro-life, with exceptions. We'll leave those 1% happen anyway. And we fall into a cycle of looking to elections and thinking, we'll elect the most pro-life candidate, because the 100% pro-life candidates, like Rick Santorum or Rick Perry of Texas, who changed his mind after actually meeting with my friend Rebecca. He was a pro-life with exceptions candidate, and then had an opportunity to speak at length with Rebecca, and he came away from that meeting changed and said so the days following that meeting on national TV. But the candidates who are 100% don't make it. And we end up settling for those who are the most pro-life. But anyway, I digress. And one of the reasons why I show you these reasons is because they are the reasons that my mom would have had to think about. Was it untimely for her to get pregnant? Yep. Was she unprepared? Yep. So, with that, I move on to this. This is a picture of her taken around the time she graduated high school. Let me tell you briefly about what did happen. I do not know details, I'll be honest with you, so I can't tell you about that. But I can tell you a little bit about what happened during her life. She was born in 1934 in Williamsport on April 10th. Yeah, it's also kind of ironic that this past Wednesday would have been her 79th birthday, but she did succumb to consequences of type 1 diabetes in 2003 and lost her life, a lifelong battle with a disease that really took its toll. But as I say, she started in Williamsport. She was ninth of 10 children, large family. And as is often the case with large families, they kind of break up into smaller subgroups, right? Anybody who's part of a large family, you might know how it is with the older siblings usually are closer than and the younger ones are closer to each other as well. But in between, there's not quite the same amount. After all, the younger ones were all kids, while the older ones were, in my mom's case, going off to war, getting married, having families. Her father was a pipe fitter, and around 1942, he took a job with the Navy Yard in Philadelphia, and thus the family, at least my grandfather and grandmother and 4 of the kids, ended up in Philadelphia shortly after he did. And that's how my mom ended up in Philadelphia. She graduated from Girls High, and as I said, that was in 1952. She was always a very dependent person. Shortly after graduating, she left home with her sister. They had an apartment together until her sister got married, started a family of her own, and of course they parted company then. From that time on, for the next few years, she lived a very independent life. On her own, in her own apartment, she moved around a bit. She took different jobs. She was primarily a bookkeeper for several of the companies in Philadelphia and around in some of the suburbs. She also worked part-time in the late 50s at a diner. It's not important exactly where. Anybody who knows the Philadelphia area knows that there's an abundance of diners, very good ones too, right? And it was at one of those diners where there was a guy who came in with his friends. They would eat dinner. They would talk. They would play chess at the table. They would engage my mom in conversation. And it was one night at the end of her time there that the one guy waited. And as she left, somehow he was able to force her into his car, took her to a nearby park, and there raped her. Left her there, found sometime later by Philadelphia police. She never told me a lot about what happened, but one thing she did say was that he was, as you understand the expression, from the other side of the tracks. He was a rich kid, not to disparage anybody here who is, but the bottom line was she couldn't touch him. She couldn't press charges. There was nothing she could do. And so she was stuck. Found out within a month or so, I guess, that she was pregnant. She didn't go back to work at that diner, obviously. And about the same time, for other reasons, she took a job at one of the Catholic hospitals in Philadelphia. And that job ended up being her life's work. She stayed there for 22 some years. She took the job to help out in the purchasing department, to help the nun who ran the purchasing department. And in time, she ran the purchasing department. It was a great place. I visited there often when I was young. One of the things to think about with regard to my mom is a very good question comes up. Why did it work? Because just telling you this story almost doesn't make sense. Except that I think in looking back on it, there are three key things that matter in her life, in her experience, that matter to mine. And those same three things can apply to any pregnancy care center. The first thing, and what I think is genuinely the most important, is she had this incredible moral compass. She had a set of principles and values that were remarkable. Among them were, put your hand to the plow, you don't look back. Among them were, this is a life. I can't get rid of it. It's a baby. And so that moral compass made a huge difference for her and for me, obviously, and for a few other people, I think. A good question might come up. Was abortion even an option? We are talking about 1959. In Pennsylvania, it probably would have been hard. But by 59, most states were allowing the exception. And New York has always been ahead of the curve in terms of allowing abortion. One of those times when we did talk about what had happened and what could have happened, she did tell me that someone had supplied her with the phone number of a doctor and simply said, he can make it go away. She knew what it meant. She said no. This statistic kind of speaks for itself because it kind of goes along with that moral compass, really. There are two groups of people, women, that at first glance I would have said, well, they're not part of this, are they? 18%, that's approximately 1 out of 6. When they go for an abortion, 1 out of 6 women will identify themselves as either born again or evangelical Christian. Now, you can question what they mean by that, and maybe we should, but nonetheless, that's who they identify themselves as. The other group that would surprise me at first glance is this one. Catholic women account for nearly a third. Put them together, that's almost half. About that moral compass thing. We've raised a whole generation, and I'm part of it. I mean, I don't cut myself out of this group, but we've raised a whole generation that doesn't talk about ethics. We talk about morality, but we don't talk about ethics. Ethics being the thing that you ought to do in a given situation. Morality being the average of what everybody is doing. This isn't new. It's been going on for a long time. We're also very good at compartmentalizing. We can put in one box the things that we should do, principles, values, etc., and in this other box we can put the things that we do. And somehow we keep the two boxes nice and separated from each other, when they ought to be like this, or maybe like this perhaps. We ought to be doing what we do based on what we ought to do, but we don't, at least on average. I know I don't. I'm part of the problem. So we do have that problem, I think. And as I say, it's not something new. It just seems to be more prevalent right now. I think people have always been able to do this separation of principles from verbs, the things that we actually do. So she had that moral compass. The only thing I can say about combating that is education. And she mentioned it, Wendy did, as part of what the CareNet does and what CareNet is about. She knew, as I said, that it was life. Couldn't convince her otherwise. I'd like to say something about that too, because the pro-choice crowd plays games. They do play games with words. We always do. We always choose the words that kind of justify our actions. A child? That's a fetus. A child? It's a lump of tissue. It's a collection of cells. At one point, that latter one is actually true, right? I mean, you guys all know enough biology to know at one point it is a collection of cells, but then again, so am I. I mean, honestly, I'm just a lot bigger than I used to be. A lot chunkier, too. I'll tell you, lighten the mood with a... You didn't know you came for a show as well. But all right. But seriously, and fetus, what a word. Does anybody remember that it comes from the Latin that simply means offspring? That it's really just a word like child, toddler, newborn, adolescent, teenager, adult. They're all words that just simply describe a different stage in your life journey. They're all equal in that sense. Yet we toss around, maybe not we in the sense of this crowd, but that especially the word fetus, gets tossed around as though it's something alien, something other than human. I am a scientist. Specifically, as Ken mentioned, I'm a chemist. My PhD's in chemistry. It's not in biology. It's not medical doctor, and I don't play one on TV. But the bottom line is, if you ask me the question, is it human, I would have to say it is from the start. The start being conception, which is a vague word as well. I mean, what do you really mean when you say conception? I think if you ask the average person, conception's when sperm meets egg, isn't it? In the medical community, conception's when implantation happens, because that's the first time a pregnancy test will test positive. because the hormones in the bloodstream change as a result of implantation. Prior to that, pregnancy tests don't work, and so doctors can't tell. And that's the only reason for it, for that particular definition. But is it human? Yeah, from the start. DNA says so. Well, it's not the DNA of a goat or a cat or a tree. It's the DNA of a human. It's offspring. Science can answer, well, also, is it alive? Well, maybe not quite in the same sense that we are. It doesn't breathe yet. But it's reproducing, it's eating. It's taking nutrients, it's growing. It's multiplying at an incredible rate. It's doing most of the things that anything categorized as alive does. It relies on the mom's lungs for oxygen. It's not doing that on its own yet. That may be one of the few distinctions, but it's still alive. And so I think science answers those two questions regarding the status of a fetus or an embryo. What science can't give you is ethics. What science can't give you is what you ought to do with it. That takes a worldview. That takes knowing that it's something that needs to be protected. And in that worldview, we have come up against two very different opposing viewpoints. Pro-life wants to talk about the life of the child and its value therein. Pro-choice wants to talk about the rights of the mom, the rights of the woman to control her body. They are not on the same level. Discussions can't happen when topics are as vastly different as those two. We've ended up with situational ethics because of it, situational morals. The other two things that I think really matter a lot, and I'll remember to try to stay close to this microphone as well, and I think I'm running out of time, but the two other things that mattered, I think, in my case and my mom's case, there was a strong family relationship there. When she found out she was pregnant, it didn't take long before her mother found out she was pregnant. Of course, they weren't living together at the time. My mom was on her own. My grandmother called her one son. As I say, the younger members in the family were all closer. My uncle had been married about a little over a year, I think, at that time. And his first child had just been born, one of my cousins. My grandmother called my uncle and said, "Janie's in trouble. She needs help." For about the next year, my mom lived with my uncle. My mom lived with my uncle as she went through the rest of her pregnancy and along the way developed toxemia. See, I was trouble back then. But she developed toxemia and needed significant help. And after I was born, thanks, Ken. And after I was born, we stayed there for a few months before she then moved to South Jersey to live with an older sister who had bought a house there. That's where my grandmother ended up as well. By that time, my grandfather had passed away. And so that's the situation I ended up growing up in. A house in suburban New Jersey, basically suburban Philadelphia. Raised by my mom, grandmother, and even an aunt. Raised by women. Okay. There is a point there. My mom never married. I guess you could ask why. Might be obvious, but she never did. And so there wasn't a father influence in my life growing up. Some say I'm a little odd because of it. But the other aspect that I think really made a difference, as I said, there were three. My apologies. I'm Presbyterian at heart, so 3-point sermons are natural. There was a strong faith community. Remember, I said that about the same time as totally inconsequential to what happened to her, she took a job at one of the Catholic hospitals in Philadelphia. The nuns also helped her there. As the toxemia developed and got worse and she needed bed rest, they said to her, you know what? You need some time off, but you need this job too. It'll be here when you're ready. And as I said, she spent 22 years in the employment of that hospital until the type 1 diabetes had taken enough of her vision that she was legally blind and had to become permanently disabled, and that's when she quit working. And that was hard on her. But that's another story. So those three things, her own values, her principles, the family relationships, the faith community. And about those family relationships, I think probably just about everybody would agree that that's not quite what it used to be either, what the family relationships are today. We're more dispersed around the country. Most of us don't live where we grew up. We leave our parents at some point to seek careers, education, whatever. But families don't end up as tied together in the long run as they once did. Faith communities, too, at least in stereotype, suffer an unfortunate consequence of being accused of being judgmental. And so, two other areas that may not come together quite as well in 2013 as it did in 1959. There's a but. The but comes from primarily the pro-choice community. Remember, 74% said having a baby would dramatically change her life. Let me tell you something, it does. They're right. It really does. And I think probably anyone in here who has a family, whether intended or not, knows that to be the case. There's no hiding there. When she was 24, that's when it happened in 1959. She was 24 at the time, just short of turning 25. She did have goals. As I said, she was independent. She really was. She moved around a bit in jobs, looking for jobs that were more in accord with her gifts and talents. She also wanted to travel. She wanted to go to school. She wanted to get an education. She did, in part. She was taking night classes throughout the 50s, learning this, learning that, finding what would work to better her, to better be able to serve in a job. She never met those goals. As I said, she knew once her hand went to the plow, she couldn't look back. That is how she was. And it's fair to ask, how did her life go? Because it does matter. I changed things for her. Well, let's see. I wasn't always the bundle of joy I started out. We, that is she and I, hit a couple rough patches, there's no doubt about it. I was a teenager once. And I was a young adult too. And I did some crazy, stupid, foolish things. Some things that caused her to stay up late at night. But in time, she met my wife, actually. I did too. I met her first, though. So I got dibs. But anyway, Christy ended up becoming my wife in 1987. Did I remember that? Whew. Let me tell you, that was a big one. All right. But she did. And they had a pretty good relationship. 1990, our first child came along. My mom had a grandson. 93, grandson number 2. 95, granddaughter. And also about 1995, I had to move further away to start that career that's always so important for us at about that age. It's fair to say that circumstances meant that my oldest was the one my mom knew the best. She had a lot of joy in her grandson. And thus asked the philosophical question that cannot be answered: how in the world do you weigh one life lived against the life that could have been lived? You simply can't. She had the life she had because of the choice she made. And I am using up too much time. There's another but, though. Here's a big one. Oh, you mean I might remind her of him? Have you heard that? I have. When she looks at him, she'll see him. Here's the honest truth from my point of view. Whether she ever thought it, in fact, I cannot know. I cannot know her thoughts. But here's what is true. She never once, through word or deed, ever let me think that. I reminded her of him. Simple truth. I'm not him. And another simple truth. Killing me would have in no way punished him, but it very well may have punished her. I offer two names there. As back in 2010, when I did start speaking with Rebecca, I also started speaking with a few other people. There were a couple of occasions where we had a chance to speak as a small group at meetings like this. Two of those women who were there, not at the same time, different occasions, Cheryl and Irene. I leave the last names off, obviously. Though Irene is really in the Netherlands, there's no way you're likely to meet her. Though sometimes she does travel over here across the pond to talk at a meeting. But I put their names up there to remind myself to tell you that sometimes abortion is presented as though it's a one-fix-all. These two women suffer consequences because they had abortions. They had them in their teen years. Well, actually, Irene, I think, was in her early 20s. Nonetheless, they had the abortion, and they have consequences. They're scarred emotionally due to what happened. It is not the fix-all that sometimes it's presented. I'm sure there are fine examples out there of women who had abortions, never think twice about it. And maybe statistics bring that up. Remember those 3,500 Remember those 3,500 abortions that probably happened today? Do you know that only half of them were being done on a woman for the first time? The other half are second, third, fourth, etc. Unfortunately. So, there are consequences. It may very well have, indeed, punished my mom. When I give talks like this, I have, on occasion, been approached afterwards by someone. And what she'll tell me is that one of the things she thinks about is, what would the child be like today? If they're older, like my age, they might even think about, what would the grandchildren be like? These are the kinds of questions that haunt women, some women, I should say, afterwards. Not all, probably not all. And thus ministries, as I heard Wendy mention, for post-abortive women and others that I'm aware of, Silent No More, Rachel's Vineyard. I mean, there are ministries out there that have met the needs of women who suffer some of those consequences of having had an abortion and can't quite deal with it. About that particular rape issue, this is a really tough statistic to really talk about, and I've tossed a lot of numbers at you tonight. Honestly, I doubt statistics when I see them, probably because I'm a science guy, and I want to see the actual evidence that goes into making a statistic. Here are two, though, that talk about how often women who are raped and become pregnant actually seek an abortion. One study said only 1 in 5. The other study said nearly half. I think the bottom line is it's not all. And it is often presented as though it is. Obviously, if a woman is raped and becomes pregnant, she's going to want an abortion. Therefore, we have to leave it in the law. Well, and by the way, for those who want to write it down, American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, 1996, that's the 40% statistic. So that's a reputable journal, not a newspaper, not a survey from Planned Parenthood either, as far as I know. I should probably pull the article and actually read it myself. But there you go. The other one that said 1 in 5 is, I'm not sure exactly the source. I'm working on it. I got it through a paper, so it's a little harder to track the citation. Anyway, what else? Ooh, here are some of my friends. Because I think it's important for you guys to realize, I don't know how often you end up caught up in conversations with people on the street. It doesn't happen to me. Maybe this just isn't that much of a topic in Tioga County. I don't know about Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, Pittston, or places like that. But when you hear it, one of my goals, of course, is to say, put a face to the problem. That way it's not a number on a paper. It's not a theoretical issue. I'm going to step away from the microphone for just a minute so I can see. Well, maybe it won't work out that well either. I had a pointer. What did I do with it? There it is. I'll try to talk real loud. The young lady in the yellow dress here, that's Rebecca. Over here, she's Shauna. She's a lawyer, went to Georgetown University. When her freshman year, I think it was her freshman year, she encountered sexual assault, became pregnant. She kept her child. Ashley lives in Detroit. Likewise, not going to Georgetown University to become a lawyer, but raped, pregnant, kept her child. Liz, high school, raped, became pregnant, gave the child up in an open adoption. She sees him on a regular basis. That's Rebecca's mom. Some of you may be familiar with Pam Stencil, also a child of rape. This guy back here, also, yours truly, that's Jim, also child of rape. This one's Christy, child of incest. She's real. I had to touch her in the arm to make sure. The point is, we're real. And when you hear someone talk about these issues, I know it's being recorded and I should be saying this into that, but when you see and hear these issues and people talk about it, think about us, because it is real. And if you need to say something to somebody, it's like, I met this guy once at this pregnancy center banquet. And he showed us, 12 people? I don't know, I can't count that fast. And they all are a mix of either having been raped and got pregnant, had their child, or they themselves were children of rape. One of them even incest. Okay? Because I think, in the end, the only way to really change things is to present the truth. And say, here's what it's like. Here's how it is. Is it easy? No. That is to be me. Or my friends here. And thus I have a slide with nothing else on it but Luke. I'm going to tell you another story. I once was not comfortable at all. Believe it or not, I'm still not comfortable with talking about this to people. Once, I feared a question. That question was, hey, what's your dad do? Well, gee, I don't know. See, because that's how the conversation would go. And then it would have to be something like, well, I don't know because. And I just simply didn't want to say these things to anyone. It's fair to say I was ashamed of it. Even to the point that when my son was old enough to ask about his other grandfather, when my kids were young, they knew my father-in-law and they knew my mom. As far as grandparents go, that's all they knew. But naturally, they learned how to add up real fast and realize two were missing. Of course, who would have been my mother-in-law, I never met. She died before I met Christy. But I couldn't tell them about my father. I couldn't tell them that my mom had been raped. As I said, I mean, even like you guys who knew me from 10 years ago when I still lived in the area, it's not the kind of thing you bring up in casual conversation. Well, yeah, by the way, you just don't do it. Well, so what's that got to do with Luke? There's a lot of shame involved in this. You know, there's shame in abortion. There's shame in being a child, just even being an unwanted child. I mean, that doesn't have to even be rape. Rape's only 1%. They say that about half of the pregnancies that occur are categorized as unintended, unwanted, crisis pregnancy. Tonight around the county, probably here in Scranton, there's a teenage girl looking at a pregnancy test strip and the little blue plus sign is showing up. She doesn't know how to tell her parents or her boyfriend. There may be some there will be adult women who, same thing's happening. She doesn't know how to tell her husband because maybe it's not his. And I hate to say these things, but this is where the rubber meets the road, as they say. So what's that got to do with shame and what's that got to do with Luke? Well, I owe this to Josiah Bancroft, who I heard about a year ago. In the 8th chapter of Luke, there's a woman. Some of you probably know this story. There are enough pastors here. I will be corrected at the end. Feel free. I won't correct you on your chemistry knowledge, however. But Jesus had made Capernaum his home base for Galilee in his ministry, and he and the disciples would travel away from there, go minister for who knows how long it took them to walk around the area, and then come back to Capernaum for some rest, relaxation, I'm sure. One of those times when he came back with his disciples, a crowd formed. They probably always did. Imagine that, these little tiny streets in the old cities over there. 3,000 people maybe. But this crowd forms around them, and there's this woman there. She's got an illness. It's not a pleasant illness. Most of you know. I mean, if you do know the story. If not, she had a never-ending period, plain and simple. But she said to herself, you know, I know these stories about Jesus healing people, and if I just go up to him and touch the hem of his garment, I'll be healed. And I can go home. Well, see, because what she had kept her from worship. What she had made her ostracized by the community. It was a stigma. Rape's a stigma. Abortion's a stigma. See a connection? When she touched him, though, he said, someone touched me. Who was it? And Peter, being the kind of guy he is, he says, what's the matter with you? Everybody's touching you. Because it was a small street. It was a big crowd. They probably were all touching him. But after a little while, she realizes that she can't just simply go home. And because of that, Jesus did something to her and for her that's far more powerful than she ever expected. He turned around, when she confessed that she was the one who touched him and why she had touched him, he simply says to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. peace. Go in peace. A little bit of political correctness. At that time, it was wrong for him to say, daughter, peace. He should have said, woman, peace. Do you see what happened? In one small statement, he took her and not only forgave her, but restored her. And that's what the gospel is really all about. It's not just about forgiveness. It's about restoration. It's about people who have experienced that. I know some in the room probably have. Some in the room maybe need to. It's not an altar call, don't worry. I said I'm Presbyterian. Sorry. I should apologize. Now, anybody got a small shovel? I could dig a hole. But the bottom line is, that young girl who's somewhere around here tonight, seeing that blue plus sign, the woman who may be pregnant because of an affair, or maybe she's pregnant because she's in college. Maybe she's over at the U. Well, I can't have a kid now. It interferes with my education. I can't have a child now. What would my parents think? They need someone to come alongside them and say, daughter, peace. Oh, and it went off again. Could you just flip? It's only one more slide. Can you just flip it? And that's the message that came from Luke. And it spoke to me because it's the same way. I just wanted to really touch the hem of the garment, go home, live my life. Hello? I'm here. Because he wouldn't leave me alone. All right. But this is a map. And I leave you with this. Honest, I'm done. I went way over time. My apologies. This is a map that was done. You guys probably know Family Life Network. They have a transponder over here in Scranton somewhere. It might have been 2011 when they did this. And so it's a map kind of circling their listening area. And all those dots on the map are a pregnancy care center somewhere. You guys are there. You can sort of see Scranton. You can also sort of see the two I'm involved with. That's Canton. That's Towanda. And as I said, soon Sayre. We're putting an ultrasound clinic there. Things are a little behind schedule. But honestly, as they used to say, seeing is believing. And ultrasound matters. That's why when legislation comes up to try to put an ultrasound in any abortion clinic, the opposition says, yeah, but the screen's got to be faced away from the patient. So that's how that goes. But you guys are here. These are the two I'm involved with, as I say. Notice there's a big hole here. Someday maybe that'll change, just like it did here in Scranton, 3 years ago. And so I leave you with this map. And, well, I guess the only other thing to do is just thank you for listening. Have a great evening.